I'm just going to start by talking a little bit more about my background, then more extensively about my PhD research, and bring it back to a few reflections on my PhD. As Sally pointed out, I'm a PhD candidate in applied health research at the University of Kent in my third year. My undergrad was actually in media studies, where I've already become very interested in personalized social media feeds and targeted advertising, essentially what we now call algorithms on social media. And I already knew I wanted to explore this whole area further. I was very critical about it and how it might affect society. So in my master's in digital humanities, I was able to focus a bit more on these recommender algorithms, as they're called, and I'm going to explain what they are in a bit. After finishing my master's, I then gained a bit of work experience as a researcher at an edtech startup that is providing parents and teachers with academically backed resources on children's mental health and other relevant topics. So I gained a really good overview of the research landscape on that kind of topic area. I was able to gain some skills in terms of working with young people in focus groups and just become very knowledgeable in this area. And then I was able to bring those previously somewhat distinct areas together in my PhD project. So the social media and algorithmic side of things and the children's mental health area in the applied health research PhD, which is funded by the ARC and is situated within the work stream Starting Well Children's Mental Health. I'm also working on another project at the University of Kent, which is the Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children, or HBSC survey. We are the England team of, so the HBSC is a WHO cross-national survey study that is measuring health behaviours and attitudes in school-aged children. Also a really great resource if there's anything that you would like to know more about in terms of young people's health behaviors, because we cover a wide range and it is basically a national set of data, and there are international reports as well. So also really great as a PhD student to just gain this experience and be part of such a large scale study. We also work on fact sheets and papers and other mini reports. We are, for example, now working on a paper that is informed by my qualitative PhD research, but based on the quantitative HBSC data. I'm supervised by Sally, who's hosting the session, and Sabina Hobart, who are also both part of the HBC and also at CHSS at the University of Kent. Now about my PhD research, and to explain the slightly dramatic title of my work, Algorithms of Emotional Turbulence, I would like to start with a quote by one of the young girls that I interviewed for my research. You can have the funniest and happiest video, and then you scroll a couple times and it's the saddest, meanest video you've ever seen. It's just a sudden mood change. And you can already see TikTok somewhat ominously looming in the background, because this is what the girl is talking about, and this is also what a lot of my research is about, these so-called short-form video platforms that operate through algorithmically curated content. This is just an overview for you of the 4 most used short-form video platforms by young people. And you can already see that they pretty much all look the same, even though they're distinct companies. They essentially have the same method of just showing very short videos one after another. So this is what the interface looks like when you open these ads. There isn't that much agency over what you see and what you can control when it comes to this, but I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. First, a bit more about the background and rationale of my research. There is actually quite a lot of research going into how social media affects us, and especially adolescents' mental health. But the interactions are very, very complex, because these environments are also getting increasingly complex. Another issue, I think, is that a lot of this research is on young adults, so mostly 18 to 24-year-olds, maybe some 16 and 17-year-olds, but there isn't much, especially not qualitative research, on very young adolescents, or basically tweens, which made me to focus on 11, 12, and 13-year-olds, because this is a very, very critical developmental period as early adolescents, and what young people experience at that time and what they're surrounded by is very, very important for their further development, and it can actually stay with them their whole life. And this is an age group that is already completely surrounded by, or is immersed in, these social media platforms. And So it's definitely important that we investigate this a bit more and also see what they think about social media. Maybe you might have noticed that there has been increased public discourse around this whole topic, and especially how social media impacts young people. And it is quite difficult to say to establish any causational links. There has been a lot of research going into this, but it's also partly been quite limited because it is such a difficult area. So what we know now is that associations are quite mixed, and it definitely needs further investigation and more longitudinal studies. What is also important to point out is that the research landscape, or essentially this discourse around it, has become quite polarized, with some saying that social media is the sole cause of a mental health crisis in young people, and others are saying that there's absolutely no scientific evidence that there is a causational link between social media use and, for example, depression and anxiety. So it is quite difficult, and there's definitely a lot more work needed. But this is also why it's so important to look into the different facets of social media and the different aspects, because these environments are becoming increasingly more complex. As I said, they're becoming increasingly more sophisticated, and young people build their culture around it, and they also build an identity on these platforms. So we can't just see social media as one, because all these platforms have such distinct features and purposes, which also becomes quite clear in my own research. So my research is structured around these three questions. How do young adolescents, so again, 11 to 13-year-olds, use algorithmically curated social media platforms? So which platforms do they use exactly? What do they do when they go on them? And which features do they use? I was really going into detail when talking to them and really trying to find out what exactly they think about it and how they use it. Then what feelings do they associate with algorithmically curated platforms, and how do they perceive them? And finally, do young adolescents actually identify harmful triggers, and are they able to self-regulate? Just to talk a bit more about the algorithms, here are some scary headlines about what some researchers already found, or some investigations. So here people would essentially create accounts that were supposed to be for young people, or registered as very young people, and they found that unfortunately, based on quite tame themes, young people were veered down very harmful rabbit holes, especially here on TikTok and YouTube, as you can see. So the algorithms that I'm talking about are recommender algorithms that are built into social media platforms to keep the user engaged as much as possible. And they do this by continuously suggesting personalized content. So essentially, the algorithm is a machine learning algorithm that learns from the user behavior and gathers behavioral data and demographic data and more to suggest the user content that keeps them engaged as much as possible. And this is something that might seem like something like, it's showing the user what the user might be interested in, but it's just showing the user whatever keeps them on the platform. And this can also be shocking content. This can be content that can anger someone. It can potentially be quite harmful to end up in these rabbit holes or in these bubbles. And young people also do recognize them themselves, as the quote down here shows. They actually have quite a good understanding of how it works, and they also recognize that you're not always being shown what you like. This is another example of how this happens. So this 11-year-old said, Andrew Tate keeps on popping up everywhere. I do not want to watch this guy. Why is this coming from stuff that is like recommended for me? Because I'm 11 years old. I've also logged in YouTube with a child's account. Now, for those of you who don't know who Andrew Tate is, he's a very, very misogynistic so-called influencer. He's actually, he's in prison now, and he's been banned from most popular platforms, but his content still keeps getting reposted, and similar content as well, and unfortunately ends up in the algorithmic feeds of, very young people like this 11-year-old, even though they don't want to see it. And there's a lot more that was also covered in the news about this topic area. But a bit more about my study design. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a qualitative approach framed by constructivist grounded theory. I opted for semi-structured interviews with 11, 12, and 13-year-olds, and I made use of photo elicitation, which is a method that involves the use of visuals to prompt conversations. And in my case, I asked young people to bring in screenshots or recordings on their phones of anything that they encounter online that evokes quite strong feelings. or that they just find really interesting. And I have to say this has been really, really helpful in aid us in conversations for the participants to reflect what they thought and how they felt in that moment when they saw this, and also for me to get a better understanding of what they see and how they experience it. I have to point out that I did not analyze or collect these visuals. I wanted the young people to be comfortable with this, so they only showed me the screenshots on their phone, and they merely served the purpose to prompt conversations, and it was quite helpful to go for this method in this case. I then went for I employed reflexive thematic analysis to identify pattern and determine themes, and this has been a very, very iterative approach in my analysis, where I was essentially identifying codes, going back to the data, and there was a lot of back and forth, and also identifying the overarching themes. But I think for this kind of research, it has been a very, very good method. So in terms of participants, I interviewed 19 young people in total. I had one brief call with every parent and child before the first interview, just to introduce myself, to get an overview of what kind of platforms they use and answer any questions. And then I had 2 one-on-one interviews with every young person individually. So in terms of gender, I had quite a good mix. And when it came to age, there were more 13-year-olds that I was able to recruit, probably also because they have more experience using social media and may be able to talk a bit more about it. But the conversations with 11 and 12-year-olds have also been extremely insightful, so I'm quite grateful for that. This is just an overview of the platforms that they mostly use. You can see that YouTube is definitely the most used one for this age group, followed by Snapchat. Over half use TikTok, quite a few use Pinterest, actually. Pinterest is an interesting one, and I'll talk about that more. And a few use Instagram. So I have to say in this case also that, of course, at this age, it's very dependent what parents allow the young people to use. So YouTube seems to be the most child-friendly and accessible, which is why they were all using it. But a lot of the young people that I talked to also said, well, I want to be on TikTok, I want to be on Snapchat, but my parents say I have to wait until I'm 13, or similar scenarios. So yeah, that's important to consider. A lot of them also were using WhatsApp, of course, but WhatsApp was something that I didn't include in my research because it is just a messaging platform and doesn't have an algorithmically curated feed. A finding I'd like to point out is what I call the short form hierarchy, which is really interesting and also emphasizes what kind of cultural phenomenon TikTok just has become, especially for young people, because essentially the ultimate goal for every young person was to be on TikTok. And they would resort to another short form platform if they weren't able to access TikTok. So either if they were not allowed to have TikTok yet, or if they couldn't access it, for example, when they were grounded and their phone was taken away, and they would go to an iPad and just go on YouTube. And again, they are very, very similar. Still, TikTok was favored, but you can see the same kind of content on all of these platforms. So it was always short form video platforms, but most ideally TikTok to them. And in these quotes from the interviews, you can see that, for example, they say when they didn't have TikTok, they went on YouTube Shorts because it was similar. But the boy also saying here that he doesn't really go on Spotlight because that's kind of TikTok's job. So they also have a very clear idea of the purposes of these platforms. Yeah, again, here, what is also quite important to point out is that, as I said, the platforms are very similar. The content also often originates on TikTok and then gets reposted onto these other platforms, even though they're very different companies. So the content really migrates from platform to platform, and yes, it's difficult to avoid that essentially when you're using these platforms. Another interesting finding is Pinterest, which is algorithmically curated, which is an algorithmically curated platform as well. But as you can see, the interface looks very different. So whereas here you only have these videos that you can scroll through, here you actually have a bit more choice of what you can click on. It was perceived very differently from the other platforms by young people. It also seems to lead young people to do things outside of social media. So they would often go on Pinterest to get inspiration for something, especially if they want to be creative. They wanted to have some inspiration for drawing or painting, or maybe ideas for redecorating their rooms. So they would go there and then spend less time on it as well, which is quite interesting. And again, they perceived it as very positively, whereas with the other social media platforms, they associated quite a mix of feelings, which I would like to show here. And this is just a word cloud from my interviews about the things that they associate, or associations that they named, sort of, with Pinterest. And you can see it's quite positive. The only thing that is sort of negative is annoying, which I think they refer to the algorithm as being too quickly in terms of updating, and they don't only want to see the same kind of content, they want to have some more diversity. But I also think it's quite interesting that someone used the word undramatic, which also speaks for the other platforms and their nature. This is TikTok as a comparison. You can see that there's already a lot more going on, and also a very, very wide mix of associations. So some positive ones, but also some quite negative ones, and also the use of very strong words like horrible, inappropriate, disturbing. Also the use of words like addicted or addicting. So yeah, it's interesting that they still want to use TikTok a lot, but they're also quite critical of it, and it doesn't always make them feel good. I think the most important finding that came up in my research was self-regulation, and how they actually are able, even though they're quite young, to offer strategies to shield themselves from harmful triggers, because they either subconsciously or consciously put some strategies in place to help themselves in avoiding bad content. Like, for example, this girl in the quote on the right-hand side says, on TikTok, you can watch videos of people that you follow and videos of anyone on the platform. And sometimes I would scroll on the one where you can see anything, and you'd see things that you don't want to see. So now that whenever I do go on TikTok, I go on the following one, so I can see things that I want to see. Just to show you again, so TikTok is the one on the left-hand side, and you can see here that you have following and for you. So now following is selected, but the default is always, when you open the app, you go on the for you, where you are on the for you feed, which is the one that is completely algorithmically curated, where the user doesn't have much agency over what kind of content they see. And this girl identified that she would see things that make her feel quite bad. So she taught herself to, whenever she opens the app, she immediately goes on following, where she only sees content by accounts that she actively decided to follow. So she kind of retained that agency, which I think is really brilliant, because it's a very specific strategy for these algorithmic platforms, and there's not much advice out there yet about these things. But then you can see that most young people are quite reflective, but some are just not able to help themselves. Also, in terms of like getting away from it, they all say time goes by so quickly when they're on there, and that makes them feel quite guilty as well, because they feel like they should have done other things like homework or things that they say are more productive. Like, for example, this boy was saying, I'm quite aware that I'm doing that and I don't want to be doing that, but sometimes it just happens and you get sucked in. So there's really a range of how they feel about it. But they are really quite aware of these things. Some also seek out parents for support, like this girl, for example, because they feel like they can't really stop thinking about them themselves, or even when they would just want help with their parents taking their phone away for a bit, because they knew they wouldn't be able to stop themselves from using it and going on these platforms. But what does this mean for policy and practice? So in terms of educational policies, I think it is essential that there is more comprehensive curriculum integration about these things. I know that in UK schools, there's already a lot of coverage about data protection and digital security and digital footprints and similar topics, which young people are very knowledgeable about. So this helps, and I think they have a really good understanding, but there needs to be a lot more about algorithmic literacy, what they can do to shield themselves, and also just media literacy in general, because these algorithms, unfortunately, are pushing a lot of misinformation, and the younger generations seem to be able to less identify some of these misinformation. So there's a lot more work needed there. Parents also really need support. What I found in my research and my conversations with parents is that they seem to have very different strategies to deal with these kind of things, and some are also not quite sure how to go about this. So while this is, I think, and this brings me to my next point, which is that this is quite a societal rather than an individual issue, and a lot of blame, but also responsibility, just relies on the individuals, like on the children, on the parents, but also on school staff to deal with these things. And there's only so much an individual can do. And as you've seen, there are self-regulation strategies, but these young people, or anyone for that matter, is in a society, or in a society that is ubiquitously surrounded by these kind of technologies and by social media. So there isn't that much that the individual themselves can do. So they need to be more support in that. And I think governments and also companies, social media companies need to take some responsibility and sort of acknowledge that. Early interventions are also very necessary because, if anything, this research has shown that at very young ages, they're already very active on social media. And while a lot of them might be fine, we don't know yet what the development of these young people is going to look like in the next few years. But if they do encounter quite harmful content at this age, or they might go down very harmful rabbit holes and be in bubbles that are not good for them, where they experience very bad things, that it might stay with them for the rest of their lives or in the longer term of their development, because this is such a sensitive period in their lives. In terms of social media regulations, we still need to work towards age-appropriate content. There is so much out there, and that also came up in my interviews, the type of content that young people see at that age. It's, or anyone for that matter, is really bad. And Ofcom is working on that, which is great. So there's a lot of work going into that, but social media companies say it is quite difficult to regulate those filters that they have to filter out bad content. So yeah, we're still at an early stage with that. And I think what's also important to point out is that these social media platforms are just not designed with young users in mind. They're made for adults. And I think another huge issue is also that young people are just on the same platforms as adults. So I think there's also a lot more work that needs to be going into this. In terms of when it comes to implementing these strategies, I think what is also really important is to involve young people. I myself did quite a lot of youth involvement with PPI during my method development and also before the interviews. And I think it's just so crucial to involve young people into developments of regulations and proposals, and also practice that is involving them directly, because they're quite capable and they should really have a voice in this. Also, we should be focusing on optimizing social media platforms and digital ecosystems rather than going for bans. So this is a huge topic of discussion as well, also throughout different countries, to basically delay or put up age limits, age restrictions, and ban phones completely. But this is not always going to be helpful, because young people will find ways around that. They already find ways around that, and it's just going to delay the issue, because if there's a ban of for 16-year-olds, for example, it's not like they're going to be protected from these issues when they're 16. So we need to, I think, this issue needs to be taken by its core and not just delayed or deflected back on the individual, which is what would happen with the ban, essentially. So, of course, a lot of research and evaluation is needed. And just to show you how current and prevalent this topic is, so these are all very recent headlines. For example, the one from BBC here from September, where they were just talking about this and how a lot of violent content is being shown to boys. You can also see here, as I said, Ofcom is working on this. They acknowledge that the algorithms must be changed, they must be tamed to protect children online. So they're working on a proposal now. But at the same time, also when talking about bans and things, there are people pointing out that it's not that simple, because young people develop at different stages, and some young people who might feel different also can benefit from social media quite greatly in terms of social environments that they might not have in their immediate surroundings. So taking that away from them might also be quite harmful. So it's very, very complicated. Just to bring this back to my own PhD path and my own research and what kind of impact I had, something that I'm quite proud of is that I was invited as an expert panelist to the development of a campaign by a nonprofit organization, Global Action Plan and Vodafone, that they released earlier this year, that is also, again, trying to raise awareness about harmful content that especially boys are exposed to. They created this brilliant video that you can see on YouTube that has like 1 million views already. So I think this has been great in terms of impact. And basically, I was able to advise them shortly after I conducted my interviews with young people around the same age. So it was great to see that I could already do something with that. And I think it's also a result of the nature of my applied health PhD, but also the environment that I was in through the ARC, of always thinking, how can I make this research applicable? What kind of effect does this have on policy and practice? So yeah, that was just a little reflection on that. And to finish up, I would like to just bring it back to the PhD research with this quote. And I still think it's sad that TikTok is on every other platform that you go on. So again, TikTok content keeps getting reposted on other platforms, but you can't really stop that. So that's definitely why I've cut down on my screen time. So the girl recognized she can't really do something about that, but she can actually change her own behavior. I've generally felt better for it because you feel like you're actually doing stuff that's proactive and productive, and your mind just feels clearer. So she sees the result of having identified a problem, doing something about it, and yeah, essentially self-regulate yourself quite successfully. And with this, I think you can just say that these young people, even though they're very young, they're already quite capable. They are very reflective. They're so smart. They just need some support from us. And yeah, thank you.